Stand right there.
All right, everybody, let's go ahead and begin. All right, everybody, welcome to the November edition of Theology on Tap. I know several of you, but for those who are new, my name is Rachel McCauley. I help moderate the Theology on Tap's release every month. Every month, usually it's the last Thursday of the month, but with the holidays coming up, we're smushing them around a little bit. In December, we will have one. It'll be December 15th, which is a Thursday that is the week before the Christmas week. So I hope to see you all there. I'll actually be giving the talk. We'll be giving a talk on the cult of workism, based on an Atlantic article that said people are replacing religion with work as the source of their behavior. So we're going to be talking about that. But tonight, we are going to be talking about something very different. We're going to be talking about the journey of Christopher and Kathy West from Mormonism to Catholicism. They're good friends of mine, they're parishioners at the church, and they have recently been welcomed into the church. They were born and raised Mormon. So I think it'll be an interesting thing. We're going to take turns asking them questions, and then after kind of the interview part, everybody is free to ask whatever questions they'd like. All right? Let's go ahead and get started. So I think actually before we do anything else, before we do anything personal, we should ask, what is Mormonism? Because most of us, besides the guy standing at our door with the skinny tie, we don't know much about it. So if you guys could begin just giving kind of a brief overview of what Mormons believe, their major tenets, etc.
So the main premise of Mormonism, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which they prefer to use, but that's a mouthful, is restoration, which they would explain in a couple of steps. First, that God loves us, and because of that, he sends prophets to, throughout time, he sent prophets to guide people and call them to repentance, and for the most part, those prophets have been rejected and killed, and that those prophets prophesied of Jesus Christ, and when Jesus Christ came, in addition to atoning for our sins, also established a church and left his authority with the 12 apostles, and that when they went out to preach in like manner of all the prophets that came before, they were also rejected and killed. And at that point, Mormons would say that the world entered into what they call the Great Apostasy, meaning that the truth and the authority to act in God's name were lost from the earth until the 1800s. So in 1820, in upstate New York, there was a teenage boy who was really confused by the just the differing sort of religious, there was a lot of religious fervor in his area. And in reading the Bible, he came across the scripture in James 1:5 that said, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. And so his story goes that he decided to go and ask God. He went to a grove of trees near his home and prayed to ask God which church to join. And his story goes that in the process of that, he was visited by God and Jesus Christ, who Mormons do see as two distinct beings, God also being material. So that is a major distinction that Mormons don't necessarily know that they make from Christians, but that he was told not to join any of the churches, and that over the course of the next decade, his story is that he was given instruction from different heavenly beings to reestablish the church that Christ had originally left when he was on the earth. And so like I said, the main premise of Mormonism is restoration, a restoration of something that was originally left when Christ was on the earth. And then where Mormons get their name from is from a book of scripture that Joseph Smith said that he translated a document from the Americas that chronicles the people here, and also a visitation from Jesus Christ to the Americas. And so a lot of people think that Mormons read the Book of Mormon instead of the Bible, but they would say that they use them both together. The subtitle of the Book of Mormon is Another Testament of Jesus Christ. And so they're meant to complement each other. The Mormons do rely heavily on the Book of Mormon because some of it feels like a little bit more accessible language. So,
could you say a little bit more about what you mean when you say God is material?
yes, Mormons teach that God has a body of flesh and bone, and is there?
So I didn't.
Christopher.
I interrupt people. So you can tell she was a missionary. We were both missionaries. She went to Brazil, I went to Finland. That's a great missionary pitch. Good job. Yeah, very good. Oh, that's right. So for Mormons, when we say we're in the image of God, for us that means like 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a nose. Like that's what we think by image of God as Mormons. And so
it's very literal.
human being, yeah. And so it wasn't until much later that I came across the idea. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. It might mean something else.
Question enough?
So God is a human being like us. How is he different?
Oh, really? Human being like God.
Yeah. Natural. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, so will you guys tell, I don't know my phone, will you guys tell a little bit about how it was growing up as Mormons, like what your lives were like, kind of what you thought of Mormonism?
I might not need the mic either. Do I need the mic? I think only Kathy
Yeah, I
needs
do.
the mic. Can you hear me, Henry, back there?
Just in case.
This is good. All right. Then you hand me the mic. I'll go first.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I didn't grow up Mormon. That's just trying to interrupt me. Right? I didn't grow up Mormon. Well, kind of. So my parents were Mormon. They got divorced when I was 5. My dad was excommunicated, and so I grew up wild. My dad became an atheist. My mom became what they call inactive, which means doesn't really, like a nun, like doesn't do anything anymore, or non, I guess, don't. So it just became nothing. And so I grew up without any sort of religious education or training. And because I was a child of divorce, I also grew up kind of without parental supervision. And so I learned about sin the hard way, in the committing of it. I had a brother who's 3 years older than me who was my supervisor during those first 11 or 12 years of my life. And so I grew up wild. And so for me, Mormonism was an introduction to Christianity. I didn't know anything about Christianity until I was invited by Mormons to learn about Christianity. And so I didn't, the first time I read Love Your Enemies, I was a teenager. And I read it and it blew my mind. It's like, oh my gosh, can you believe it says this in here, to love your enemies? So it was a revelation for me. So, and so for me, finding Mormonism was finding how I found Christ.
Can I ask, Christopher, were you introduced to Mormonism through your family, through your neighborhood? How?
Yeah, so it was kind of around us, but we kind of saw Mormons as an annoyance. Like if traffic was bad, my dad would swear about the Mormons or something. So they were kind of a force of nature that was kind of a negative force of nature. And I grew up in Utah, by the way, so I was surrounded by Mormons. But I don't know, they're just kind of odd, weird people, as you guys probably thought they were. And in Utah, though, there's churches everywhere, Mormon churches everywhere. And next to high schools or next to junior highs, there's Mormon buildings. And during the school day, they have something called release time, where you go to the Mormon building and learn about Mormonism during the school day. Mormons call it seminary. The Mormons had seminary and the school side is called release time. And I had a Mormon friend when I was in 9th grade who said, there's this class you can take, you don't have any homework, you can literally just put your head on the desk and sleep. And I said, sign me up, that sounds amazing. And so I went to this class and they started talking about Mormon stuff. And yeah, I had the idea it was Mormon stuff, but the way it pitched to me was I didn't have to do any work. And when I showed up, they started talking about God, and I thought, this is great. And I was like, there is no God. Your scriptures are silly, that kind of stuff. So I was attacking their religion, but I got really into it, right? So I was reading the scriptures and I was arguing with them. And the teacher actually loved me because generally the kids were putting their heads down and falling asleep. And then I was attacking their faith and they were sitting up and listening. So the teacher's like, finally, I got students listening to it. So that was my introduction. And I started reading the Book of Mormon. I fell in love with the Book of Mormon. I loved it. I found Christ through reading the Book of Mormon.
Alright, so that's what convinced you, because coming from an atheist family, I would think that you would have a grudge against it, that you would think it was
So I grew up in Utah, and my parents and like we had generations of my ancestors were Mormon pioneers that came across in the plains and almost died in the snow, and like that was the family story growing up. And I was a very earnest kid. Like I just wanted to do the right thing, and Mormonism definitely provides a structure. Like there's so much structure. Like you're gonna do this, like you're gonna go here on Sunday. There's like activities. There's ways to serve people. There's there's so much to be able to do to help other people, and to be really just doing good things for people. So I lived a life of Mormon milestones. I was baptized when I was 8, which is the earliest that you can be baptized. I held leadership positions in the youth group for the young women, and I went to BYU. I went on a mission to Brazil and learned to speak Portuguese and go and give that whole spiel from the beginning in a different language, and then we met at BYU. So and then we got married in the Mormon temple, and it's a good thing we didn't meet when he was feral as a young child, because I would not have been interested at all.
Because he's so tame now.
Yeah. So I was really, for lack of a better term, I was in it to win it. Like, I was there, and that was what had been presented to me, and there was so much good that came into my life because of Mormonism. And so, for so many reasons, I didn't have occasion to question it.
Okay, so now let's start turning to Catholicism. What was it about Catholicism that piqued your curiosity or attracted you?
I first want to say one more thing about Mormonism, especially in Utah. One of the beautiful things about it is the sense of community you have. So in Utah, there's such a high percentage of Mormons that your church is a walk away. On Sunday morning, all the neighbors come out of their houses and they walk or drive down to the local church. So the people, you don't choose what church you go to if you're Mormon. You go to the one that's closest, right? That's the one you go to. You're supposed to go to that one. And so there's a really wonderful sense of community. So I didn't want to leave that part out. Part of our growing up experience, we had so I started experiencing that as a teenager, but then we continued to experience it after we got married. We had just a wonderful experience in that kind of Mormon, tight-knit Mormon community. So, my first introduction to Catholicism, I didn't realize I was being introduced to Catholicism. When I was a teenager, there was a Mormon apologist named Hugh Nibley, who was just a genius. I have one of his books over here, Mormonism and Early Christianity. So Mormons claim to be the original Church of Christ. We ignore 2,000 years of church history because we think that's the apostasy. But Hugh Nibley tries to tie together early church practices with modern church practices, especially what happens in Mormon temples. And Hugh Nibley refers to the church fathers. And when he's talking about the church fathers, he's not talking about Joseph Smith, he's talking about the early... Yeah, exactly. And so he's quoting them, and he's talking about them. And so I was reading, that was my first introduction to kind of early Catholic history, and I just thought it was so interesting, and I kind of love that stuff. And that's, in fact, the reason I was interested in classical education, was because of Hugh Nibley. He would quote things in Latin and expect you to understand them, and I just realized my ignorance and wanted to know more, and I wanted to be able to defend my faith as well as he did. And so I took a job at a classical school 9 years ago. And this was by the time we moved away from Utah, we were in Arizona. I started working in this classical school. And for the first time in my life, I met a believing Catholic. So I'd met Catholics before, but they were like Italians. That's not an insult against Italians. This was like, they weren't Catholic, they were like Catholic, right? And so I met people who were actually Catholic who believed it. And it was shocking to me, and we had conversations, and... All right, thank you. In the school that I teach at Great Hearts, and I taught at Arizona at Great Hearts, and they asked me to teach, I had a science background, they asked me to teach the 6th grade science class. So I opened up the book and I started to teach these kids, and I'm reading Aristotle, which I've never read before. I'm like, what is this? What is this? This is what I wanted, but what is this exactly? And Aristotle taught me to think about, to understand the difference between substance and accidents. And so in conversation with Catholic friends and in reading this little 6th grade science book, I understood transubstantiation as something more than hocus pocus, right? Something that could actually kind of make logical sense. And that same book also got me thinking about causality. So if you trace causality, the universe, the material universe is not its own grandpa, right? The material universe could not have created itself. And so for things to exist, for the material world to exist, it would have had to have an immaterial creator. There has to be things that, so existence exists. It could not have come from nothing, because nothing cannot do anything, let alone create the universe. And so there had to be something at the foundation of existence that was not itself material. Once I understood that, and in fact, it took me a while to understand that argument, like maybe 8 more years. Then I had a real issue, I had a real problem, because the Mormon God is material, right? I started thinking, So that gave me kind of some room to doubt Mormonism. In that same school, Great Hearts, I also taught economics, and in economics we're reading Thomas Aquinas. And I'm flipping through Aquinas, and he says, he's talking about theft and property ownership, and he says, well, because man is created in the image of God, and the image of God resides in man's reason. And I read that, and I thought it was in my fingers and toes. It's in my reason. Oh, okay. Well, that actually makes a lot more sense. So I started to be drawn towards the Catholic teachings and started to doubt Mormon teachings.
So can I ask, were the seed of your doubt, did that happen at the same time as your attraction to Catholicism, or were you doubting and then discovering Catholicism later? Or they were the same thing? You doubting?
No, well, I guess it's a long, complicated story. A 9-year story, and so there are some complications there. No, there were times of doubt before my. They happened kind of at the same time, but I think doubt first, and then interest in Catholicism later. There was a time I was teaching the men's group at the Mormon church, and I was having a good time. I enjoyed it, and then I taught one lesson, and there's a quote. It was by Ezra Taft Benson, one of the leaders of the church. And he said, obey the prophet always. Even if he tells you to do something wrong, obey him, right? So I teach in the class, and I read this, and I share it in the class, and I say, I don't know what I think about this. And everyone in the class is like, oh no, that's right, that's true. I was like, So that was like a moment of doubt for me. And Kathy was going through a moment of doubt at that same time with Mormonism.
Yeah. All right, Kathy, so some of your doubts, some of your problems with Mormonism, and then leading to attraction to Catholicism.
Yeah, okay. So I had kind of grown up just with this pattern, like if I have a question that I can't work out, like just write everything down and pray about it, and I read my scriptures and I'll find the answer, and then everything will be like resolved in my mind. And the question that I ran into, which I feel a little silly that it took this long to come to it, but the question that came up for me was really the question of like, what is women's role in the church and in God's plan? Mainly because the Mormon church started talking frequently about how like gender is really important, and there's something eternal about it. And I was like, okay, there's that. And then the idea that for Mormons, like God is unequivocally male, and that like people are supposed to become like God. That's like the goal of this life for Mormons. And it was like, well, if he's male and gender is as important as everybody's saying that it is, there is no blueprint for me as a woman. Like, what does that even mean? And so I, set about thinking that, there's going to be an answer for this, and wrote down all my questions and said my prayers and read my scriptures, and I just kept coming out really blank. It was like there's nothing there. And this was over years. So, the day that he came out with his lesson, where he'd been like, I think everybody's blindly following. I came out of the women's class, the women's Sunday school, crying, like I had been for many weeks, because I was like, this is so, like, none of my answers are here, and everything we're talking about is stupid, and I hate this, but I'm just going to persevere like a good Mormon pioneer and just do this for the rest of my life. And he said, we don't have to do this. Like, so I won't get into all the details of like things that we were trying to figure out, but I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know quite what to do. And we had a lot of friends who were leaving the Mormon church and leaving to nothing, leaving to a lot of anger, leaving to a lot of frustration. And I didn't quite want to go to that place, especially because I saw like how confusing it was for their kids. So at some point we just decided like, okay, we're gonna stay, we're gonna do this. And I was, like I just figured like, I can't find the answers. Like I had searched for several years. But I still always had that question. And it was funny, when we met you, I mentioned that I had this concern that I had never been resolved. And the great thing about Rachel is that she said, well, have you read the Bible? And I was like, yes, I read the Bible. I was so offended. And then, like, after I kind of let my ego go, it set in, like, oh, I must have missed something. Like, there's some, like, if that's the answer to, like, this, like, really deep, frustrating question that, like, I have no blueprint for my life as a woman who wants to follow God. If that's the answer, then I missed something. And it took me a while to realize I had just been looking through a foggy lens. Like, I couldn't find an answer because I couldn't see it. So Christopher definitely got interested before I did in Catholicism. I was like, that was not on my radar as an answer at all. And he wanted to go to this inquiry class, and he wanted to read these books, and he wanted to pray the rosary, and I
started to pray the rosary.
Yes. So he was like, let's pray the rosary, and he knelt down and he was like praying the rosary, and I was just looking at him. It was very uncomfortable. So I was just like staring at him like, I don't know what is happening in my marriage, in my life. What are we doing?
Okay. So I started to become more Catholic at this point. And she says, this line, she says, what's the point in becoming Catholic? The only thing that's changed is you drink now and your prayers are rote.
I was...
She can be very feisty.
Yeah, I was resistant, let's just say that. Because I just, it was funny, because here was this thing that was falling apart for me, but I couldn't, like, it just seemed like jumping ship to Catholicism seemed like insane.
Can I jump in here, please? Christopher, can you say anything about like what books you were reading? Because you move first pure reason and trying to understand things, whether it's any books, any speakers, any things that really like clinched it for you.
Well, I delved in pretty hard into things. A lot of it was through conversation, as Rachel knows from experience. I invited Rachel and her husband over to our house, and I said, "Convince me to become Catholic."
And I was like, what are you getting at?
I was like, "Was that the first time we met?" That's like a conversation starter.
I was dying.
Well, because I wanted what I believed to be true, right? And to know if it's true, well, you hit it as hard as you can. And if it breaks, it wasn't true. So that's kind of always how I dealt with my faith. And that's why for a long time I was really convinced of Mormonism, because I could beat a lot of people in arguments, right? I could argue with somebody, I could argue with atheists, I could argue with, I went on a mission, argued with people for 2 years. And I did great. So I was very convinced that I was right. But what I was reading, it's hard to remember the order of things that I started discovering things in. I listened to a lot of podcasts. I listened to some Pints with Aquinas. I found randomly a kind of radical guy named E. Michael Jones. I read his book, Logos Rising. Logos Rising is amazing book. And that was a great book because it went over the stuff that I was teaching in my 6th grade science class. It went through all the kind of pre-Socratic philosophers and then the history of philosophy and how this is kind of one of the great draws to Catholicism. So one of my doubts about Mormonism is that the Mormon God is irrational. Mormon theology is irrational, right? God cannot be material because a material being did not create the material universe. It's impossible. And so if you believe God is material, your theology is irrational. It doesn't work. And so one of the things that drew me to Catholicism was that it combines faith and reason. Faith and reason are harmonious. So in John 1, the Logos was made flesh. Right? The Logos is God, the Logos is made flesh. And so John wrote that in Greek, so Greek philosophy, the truth of Greek philosophy, and the truth of Revelation and the history of the Jews is united into one thing. That human reason aims at God, and then God, by revelation, comes down to us. And that was just so beautiful. So.
This is not a segue, we're just going a different direction. I do want to say that, well, I guess I'll say this. I did not want to break things. Christopher wanted to, let's hit this and see if it breaks, and I was like, why are we hitting anything? There's a lot of good things going on here. And for me, it's looking back, it seems obvious and kind of inevitable that here is this very reasonable, beautiful, wonderful thing, full of depth and meaning that is inexhaustible. That seems obvious to me now, but it was very not obvious to me going into it. And so I went to this class with Christopher basically to humor him. I was like, okay, I just want to see where you're coming from. I'm not going there, but I'm along for the ride. And every time I left that inquiry class, I was like, oh, it makes so much sense. I was really mad about it. And there was a part of me that felt so resistant in part because I was like, I've lived my whole life in this space where a lot of good has come from that. So much good in my life came from this upbringing that I had and came from the things that I had learned and the thing, what I had practiced. And so it felt for me, it felt like I was rejecting something good for something that was unknown. And that felt really, really scary. And I mean, we had several go-rounds, and I just there was a point at which I thought okay, all of this makes sense, and so is that it? I give up all of this goodness for this thing that makes sense in my head. And so Christopher gave me a great gift that I also resisted. He threw me in this Marco Polo group. If any of you are familiar with Marco Polo, it's a video chat, and he threw me in this group with 2 people that I just love, who we knew in Arizona, who are Catholic, and said, ask them your questions. And I was like, oh, why? They're gonna want me to be Catholic. And I was just so grateful for their generosity. And I've called it, with Christopher, the great Catholic patience. That he was pressuring me. He was like, do this thing, come on, let's be baptized. And every other person that I asked questions to, all the Catholics, they were like, no, whoa, slow down. You take your time. You don't rush into this. If it takes you 10 years, fine. And so they were generous with their time, willing to answer my questions, a step at a time, give me things to read, and without any pressure. And so one of them, I actually asked her to be my sponsor when we were baptized and confirmed, because I knew that if at the last second I backed out, she wouldn't hold it against me. And she's like, oh yeah, she bought plane tickets, she flew from Washington. I was like, if I back out on this, she's like, I'm just coming to see you for Easter, that's it. So I felt very grateful that there were people who were kind of they were willing to give me whatever it is that I was asking for without pressuring me.
So Rachel's husband, Doug, told me to stop pressuring her too. So you can get baptized Easter, she doesn't have to, lay off. Okay. I also want to say on books, I gotta give a shout out to my godfather, Alessandro Coda, who's a coworker of mine. I'm in a book club with him and John Ripley. And one of the reasons I can think of the names, because also Rico's really smart and he has us read all these really heady books. The Revolt of the Masses by Jose Ortega y Gasset, Vogelin, I forgot the name of his book, Eric Vogelin's book. But we were reading these really heady intellectual books that made both me and John Ripley, sorry to out you, John, made us realize that the Protestant Reformation was a disaster for the human race. And that was interesting, yeah.
Alright, so getting back down to the brass tacks, down to the ground. So how would you guys, so we've heard your story, do you have any advice for how we would talk to Mormons, or from your background, how you would communicate well with Mormons, considering that you know both sides of the story now?
Okay, so what drew me to Mormonism was the Book of Mormon, like I said. But I didn't understand what it said when I read it. So it wasn't like the doctrine in it that was convincing. It talked a lot about Jesus, and I liked that, and there was commandments there that were interesting, and Mormonism is really great for those who have no religion, have no background in religion, whose maybe lives are kind of messed up. Mormonism will clean you up, it'll get you serving others, it will teach you commandments that Christ taught and get you to obey them. So it's really wonderful in that way. But as I was reading it, I just felt good. And for Mormons, they say, well, it's really interesting. Joseph Smith, in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith, he said that Christ asked the apostles who he was, and Peter said that you're Christ, the Son of God, and Christ said, well, no man told you this, God the Father told you this. And upon this rock I'll build my church. And Joseph Smith said, the rock of his church is that revelation from God. Each of you can know directly from God, like Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And so, for Mormons, we take you the Book of Mormon, we give you the Book of Mormon, we say, pray about it, God will tell you that it's true, right? And so you read it, and how does God tell you that it's true? Well, you feel good about it, right? And you feel good about it, and then you read it, you feel good, God's talking to me, he's telling you that it's true, right? So Mormonism, like I said, is not rational. It's an emotional, revelatory kind of religion. So you see that and understand that. For Mormons, how do they know something's true? Well, it feels good. Now, if you tell them, hey, you're not a Christian, you're not a real Christian, your God is irrational, right? They're like, that doesn't feel good. They're going to sense an evil presence coming from you, right? So for Catholics, it's something like this. Objective reality exists and can be known. God, the Logos, created reality in an orderly way, makes sense. We have his image in our reason. Our reason can comprehend reality. If you follow that, you'll become Catholic. Well, that's the two different approaches to knowing what truth is, right? For Catholics, it's like, let's be reasonable. Let's follow where this goes. Let's follow these things and see what lines up. For Mormons, it's, does it feel good, right? And not feel good like pleasure, but feel good like in your heart. And
so I would say that that's like just an assumption to know going into a conversation, because I did not have any Catholic patience. As soon as I was like, yeah, we're doing this, then I was like, to some of my Mormon friends that I have known for years, they were like, why are you doing this? And I was like, here's everything. And it was like, it was way too much. And I didn't realize that had been a sort of shift in me in assumptions. And so, like, what I ended up finding is that I was talking completely past them. Like, they could not understand what I was saying. And, like, all the feedback that I got back in conversation was like, I'm not even landing. Like, there's nothing in what I'm saying that's even landing with them. And so just knowing, I mean, I think of the friends who shared things with me. One of the books up there is The Reed of God. That was kind of an answer to my question of like, what's the role of women? Like, where do women even have a place in God's plan? And that book, like, it has that sort of rational, like, everything in it makes sense, but it did have this sort of feeling aspect that was really reassuring to me as a Mormon.
Are there any common places that you can meet a Mormon and then build off of it? Because it sounds so foreign. Like, your concept of God is different than ours. Even your place of Jesus is different than ours in a hierarchy there. Like, what's common that you can start here and then build a little bridge?
Yeah, I would say that Mormons do not see themselves as Protestants. They obviously don't see themselves as Catholics. But there are certain things that they, like the idea of authority is actually really big for Mormons. And so that's like the idea of somebody just like going and starting their own church, which is, I mean, kind of what Joseph did, but the story of Mormonism is like that the authority was not present on the earth, and that needed to be restored, and that was really important. And so the idea of somebody acting as like in the hierarchy of the church with authority from God is really a big deal and something that can be built on.
So the official story is that John the Baptist came down and gave Joseph Smith what Mormons call the Aaronic priesthood, and then Peter, James, and John came down and gave Joseph Smith the Melchizedek priesthood. So the idea is that the Mormon story is that these apostles came down and gave Joseph Smith apostolic authority, right? They gave him which we call the priesthood. And so we don't call ourselves an apostolic church, but we say we have God's priesthood, is how Mormons would say.
I know that I've appreciated how much Mormons and Catholics align on social issues. So Mormons also have a really strong community, a strong social basis, a strong awareness of conservative values, and that's powerful, especially in today's day.
And this is something that one of the reasons I started to worry about Mormonism before I became Catholic is that Mormons tend to be right on things, right? So they published a little pamphlet about 2 decades ago on a family. And they said, men are men and women are women, and a family is a man and a woman. They get married and they have kids. And they published it 2 decades ago, and I read it and was like, oh, that's kind of nice. And now I'm like, that was revelation. That was like, wow. But they're good on that stuff, but they don't have a strong philosophical backing for their beliefs. So Mormons in California backed Prop 8, which is like against gay marriage, right? They backed it very strongly, but it was like, why are we backing this? Because the prophet told us to. But there's no argument for, there's no like logical argument against homosexuality. There's no logical argument about having kids. So Mormons traditionally have had really big families, but they're starting to not have big families. So Kathy and I, for example, we used contraception when we were first married. Why? Because everybody else did, right? There wasn't like any sort of strong argument against it. And so Mormons are starting to use contraception and have small families. And then prophets, the leaders of the Mormon church, have kind of stopped talking about it. So certain doctrines will just kind of fall out. And the doctrines that they are right on, there's no real great logical argument for them. It's all just about following the prophet.
So speaking of doctrines that fall in and out of fashion, I have to ask you about polygamy, because I feel like that's sort of the elephant in the room. Like, do Mormons stand on that, and is it still a thing in your church?
Yeah, that's, I mean, that always comes up. So it ended, polygamy like officially ended with like some sort of decree from the prophet like 100 years ago. And for most mainstream Mormons, if you talk to them now, like most of them are appalled by it. And it's I mean, growing up, like the idea of polygamy just really stressed me out. That was part of the history. So if you talk to any mainstream Mormon, like that's not a thing that they're actively seeking or wanting, or like they would just kind of be appalled. There are smaller branches of Mormonism that have splintered off, and they've made their own communities doing that, but they would not be considered like accepted into mainstream Mormonism. One of the challenges that if you run into a Mormon who's questioning or who is angry at the church, one of the challenges is that it's polygamy has not necessarily been uprooted from the theology, in the sense that when Mormons get married, they get married at a special building called the temple, which is not used for regular weekly worship. And the idea is that you're getting married not only for time, but for all eternity, that you will be married in the eternities. But if somebody's married, if a man is married and his spouse passes away, he can be married or sealed to another wife. So it's like, oh, well, what happens in the eternities? And the answer is kind of like, well, God will figure it all out. But there are people who are like, well, there must be polygamy in the eternities. And there hasn't ever been a statement from the Mormon church that that's not the case. And so a lot of the friends that I had who were leaving that was one of the things on their list of something that really, really troubled them.
And, well, in fact, this is a great entry point into Mormonism. So for Mormons, there's this kind of haunting past of polygamy and maybe a possible haunting future of it in the heavens. And what is the role of women in the church? For Mormons, Mary doesn't exist really. She's hardly thought about or mentioned. But Mother's Day and Christmas, maybe she probably won't be mentioned on Mother's Day. Maybe she'll be brought up on Christmas. The story is really not about her at all. She doesn't appear. But part of Mormon theology we didn't bring up is that God the Father has a wife. That's part of Mormon theology. Okay? So there's an idea of a heavenly mother. We know nothing about her except for nothing. Well, really nothing about other than that, really. Right? It's all conjecture. It's all speculation. But there's this idea that there's a heavenly mother. Mormon women, especially, are starving to know what that means. Right? What does that mean that we have a heavenly mother? And so a couple years ago, there was a Presbyterian friend of mine brought this up with me, and he said, well, Catholics have a heavenly mother too. They say that's Mary. And I heard that and thought, oh, that's really weird, it's really strange. And so Mary is what cut off my Mormon head. That's what ended Mormonism for me. I think it was Alan's class we were sitting in, and I think it's Revelations 12 and 13, or 11 and 12. And John, the Revelator, he sees the ark in the temple. Now, this is very important to me. As a Mormon, this is the building I was married in on my tie. It's the Salt Lake Temple, right? This is the peak of worship. This is the goal of a Mormon is to be in this building in the temple, right? Mormons consider themselves the true house of Israel, right? We are the true house of Israel. We have the true temple. We have the true church restored by Christ. And the temple is a symbol of that restoration, right? We have the authority. We're doing we have the authority to seal in a way that we have the authority to do sacraments. We don't call them sacraments, but ordinances that last for eternity. Because we have the power of God, the authority of God, and we do that in temples. Okay, so temples are the pinnacle of Mormon worship. So in Alan's class, I learned that Mary's the ark. John looks up in heaven, he sees the ark, and it's Mary. So the ark that Moses had built contained the Word of God written in stone. Mary contained the Word of God. The ark that Moses built contained the rod of Aaron. Mary contained the high priest of God after the order of Melchizedek. The ark that Moses built contained the bread from heaven. Mary contained the actual bread from heaven. Right? She is the true ark. If you do not have the ark, you do not have the temple. And I realized that. So the Mormon temple, the center of it, is that the holiest space in the Mormon temple is an empty room. There is no ark. It's gone. Just like it was in Jesus' day. In Jesus' day, there was no ark. Christ restored the ark to Jerusalem in the form of Mary, right? Mormons do not see that at all. And this is one of the reasons, before he became Catholic, Kathy said, well, why not Protestantism? Why not Buddhism? Why don't we become Jews? Why Catholicism? And this is why. Who has Mary? Who has the ark? Who has the ark has the temple. And for me as a Mormon, that was the most important thing.
We'll open it up for questions in just a minute. Do you guys have any closing thoughts about Mormonism in general?
I would say that if you have friends or coworkers or neighbors or whatever that are Mormon, there are kind of different types of Mormons. And those who are active are going every Sunday. They are serving in their callings, the assignments they've been asked to do. They're probably, it's very likely that they are not interested in Catholicism. And they've got a lot to do because they've been assigned friends in their ward, their parish, to take care of every month. And so you can just know that if you need help, if you need some sort of service in your life, ask them, and they will show up for you. They are there to do what needs to be done, and they will make very good neighbors. And they may not be interested in talking about why they're not Christians, because they're like, look, man, I just, a tree fell over in your house and I took it off. What else do you want? Then there are other Mormons who are questioning, who are in a place that I was for many, many years, and just talking about your faith, especially finding out like what is it that they are concerned about, what is it that is so troubling, there's an answer for all those things. At least as far as I found in Catholicism. And so those people who are in that space of like, I don't know what to do about this thing that has had a lot of goodness, but also like a lot of pain and confusion, maybe open to talking about things. And then there are a lot of people who have left. I think that we are unique in the fact that we're not angry about Mormonism. So many people that I know who have left are really angry about the Mormon Church, feel that they were conned or manipulated. And I hear their reasons. That wasn't my experience, but they may not be able to see past their anger. I don't know what to do about that, but once that anger has subsided, they may be interested in talking.
All right, so anybody have any questions?
Oh,
wait, he's got one more.
Don't say they're not Christian. It's rude. They are Christians. Their theology's not, but they are, right? Christ says, if you love me, keep my commandments. Mormons serve, what you do unto the least of these, you do to me, right? Mormons they see Christ in others, and they seek to serve Christ by serving others. That is their religion. That is Christian. They're wonderful. The active Mormons are wonderful, wonderful people, doing their best to serve Christ every day, not just on Sundays.
So who is Jesus then? if God is material human and Jesus is his son, is he no different than you?
Well, I would say that that's why, the faith crisis inevitably comes. And so if you have been a good neighbor as well, when that faith crisis comes, you can be the person to say, have you read the Bible? And it will be a eye-opening, revelatory thing to say, because you've been there. But recognize that there's goodness in what it is that they and what they've done.
And so that theological stuff is just really heady. And it doesn't really matter for Mormons. For Mormons, Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He's the Redeemer of the world who died for your sins, right? All that stuff is Mormon language, right? Now, if you go into the theology, for Mormons, theology is historical. It's a bit odd. For us, I'm still talking about. So Mormons are kind of like Jews in that you're Mormon, you're kind of a Mormon. Anyway. I still actually wear my Mormon garments, which is the Mormon underwear. I like it. I like the symbol. So it symbolizes the Mormon garments symbolize the veil of the temple. So you're wearing the veil of the temple, which is the body of Christ. You're wearing the flesh of Christ over yourself, right? Christ covers you. That's beautiful, right? It represents your priesthood. It represents it represents the flesh of Christ covering me, and I think it's beautiful. It's something that works. That when you work right next to you, that is Christ next to you. I just think it's beautiful. So I wear my temple tie. I love that stuff. But for Mormons, they think we're children of God literally, right? They think that we existed before we were born as sons and daughters of God and his wife, and that Jesus Christ is the firstborn and best of the children of God, and the perfectly obedient one. And so God and the Son are one in will, right? So the will of Christ, the will of the Father are one, and that's.
Your goal is to meet us with Catholic.
So you sacrifice your will to try to do that, right?
Well, I still have so many questions. But does anybody else have questions? So we can just open it up.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing your stories. Really educational. So I appreciate that. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I have heard, just to be totally honest, I have heard that when you die, men get their own planets and women can only get their own planets if they're married. Is that anywhere?
It sounds right.
It's like a question that I don't want to answer because it's like,
That's what I was in. Okay.
I got a good one actually. So we have.
Could everybody hear the question?
So she heard that when Mormons died, the men get their own planets, and that the women only get their own planets if they're married. Well, I think it's true for men or women, right? You're only in fact, the highest. So yes, So you cannot get to heaven unless you're married if you're Mormon, right? There's heaven, like the actual heaven if you're married, and if you're not married, you're like, you get to heaven, but you're like, kind of in heaven. Yeah, it's like, you're in lower heaven if you're not married. And so when I had a friend, one of the first Catholics I met who was actually a Catholic, he became a monk, right? He became a Normandy monk. And I just felt it was a tragedy. I thought, he's never gonna get married. He's damned, basically, right? I just was like, no, I tried to talk him out of it. I tried to read him from the Book of Mormon. It's like, this is a mistake. Yeah, so the marriage is the ultimate way. It's the highest sacrament, right? It's the highest ordinance. And God is material, so we have a neighbor, okay. We decided to become Catholic and moved out of our ward, out of our parish. Not intentionally, that's the way it kind of fell. So the parish that we live in now, down by Pleasanton, we've never gone to. We've never gone to church there. But the Mormons have not stopped visiting us, and not in an annoying way. They fixed our faulty electrical wiring in our house way. They fixed the leaky plumbing under my house way. The checking in on Kathy's mother, my mother-in-law, who lives with us. Just like serving us, painting Kathy's mother's house, right? Just service. And one of these friends, before he got baptized, he came to try to stop us and talk sense to me. And we had that experience where I was talking to him, and I could just tell, just bouncing off of his head. I just had no idea what I was saying. And in one of these conversations, he showed me a picture, like the newest NASA telescope. And he was like, look at all these stars. And he showed it to me a couple times, and I was like, yeah, those are pretty, okay, whatever. And then he's like the space is just infinite. There's like planets for all of us. So for him, the NASA photos are evidence of Mormon doctrine being true. That's your question. Are you gone?
Yeah, you.
Okay, yeah, there's a.
So I'm kind of interested on the origins of Joseph Smith. Is it your opinion that A, he was either a shyster, or B, which is a little more, I guess, spicy, could it have been a demon masquerading as John the Baptist who came to him? Have you thought about that?
There are, I have many friends who feel a deep sense of anger and betrayal about Joseph Smith, because in their view he was like a con man. For me, I haven't jumped into like all of that history. In part because for me that wasn't the question that was important to me, but for a lot of Mormons who have left, historical like choices that he made, things that he said, they hold a lot of anger for that. The hard part about Mormon history is that there are like a lot of things are taken from journals written by people like later who had conflicting interests. Like there's just a point at which I thought like this is all so muddy. Like is this actually true or is it not? And that was the question for me. So I haven't spent as much time as somebody else. And if you run into an angry Mormon, they will probably have a lot more to be able to share with you.
Yeah, I never. I feel like my own personal feeling about it is that he was sincere. Now, there's something interesting you should know. For Mormons, our theology comes directly from God. I keep saying "our." Forgive me. And so the idea is, well, how do we know God the Father has a body? Well, Joseph Smith saw him, right? Duh. And so, but in fact, if you read, and this is something I've just stumbled into myself, but if you read Mormon scriptures, so we use the Old Testament, we use the New Testament. They use the Book of Mormon, which is for the Kathy mentioned this, but it's like a scriptural history book. It's 1,000 years of history for the Jews who left Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity in 600 BC, and came to the Americas and had lots of kids and lots of wars and lots of things and learned about Christ, and that's a book of scripture. And then there's Joseph Smith's Revelations, which is called the Doctrine and Covenants. And And in that book of Joseph Smith's Revelations, Joseph Smith is talking about the Trinity. And he says, well, the Holy Ghost, he says, God the Father has a body of flesh and blood, and the Son has a body of flesh and blood. But the Holy Ghost does not have a body of flesh and blood, otherwise it would not be able to dwell in us. So it's spirit, right? And so I realized in reading that, as I was kind of having my doubts and learning about Catholicism, he's speculating, right? He's philosophizing. He's not coming up with theology because he's received a revelation. He's making theological arguments, right? And Mormons don't see that. It's in their scriptures, right? That argument is in their scriptures. And so so I just want to point that out, that that's maybe something you talk to Mormons about. To answer your question, I think he was thinking about this stuff and trying to solve the problem. Kathy did some research and found out about his interactions with Catholicism, which is interesting. Tell me about that. You didn't know Catholic until he was...
Yeah, it's very possible that Joseph Smith never met any Catholics until after the Mormon Church was already established. And they were, I should have checked my notes beforehand. I think it was Nauvoo.
So he was in his 30s, late 30s or something?
Yeah, Nauvoo, Illinois, that they built the temple, that temple eventually was destroyed, but...
Before you share that story, I just want to say one thing. The idea is Protestantism... he was surrounded by Protestants who were fighting all the time about what truth is. And that's what he grew up in. And so, he didn't have the truth in the way that we Catholics see it, right? He didn't have the gospel pure. He had a bunch of fighting different religions around him, and he's trying to sort it out. That's how I see it. You want to tell the rest of the Catholic story? It's interesting.
Yeah, apparently there was a Catholic priest that Joseph Smith really admired, and they had a good relationship, and the Catholics in the area needed a place to celebrate Mass, and they allowed them to do that in the assembly hall, Mormon assembly hall, that was connected to the temple. And then when the Mormons were getting kicked out of there, as they got kicked out of lots of places, they tried to sell the building to the Catholics, and the Catholics said, no, we're okay.
But, so the Mormons let the Catholics celebrate Mass in the temple, and that's my vision for the future. I just want all of those beautiful buildings serving Mass.
You had mentioned that Mormons believe that the Church of Christ apostatized. What church do they view that? Do they view it as a Catholic church that apostatized, or some other?
So, in the Mormon vision of the apostasy, which church was it that apostatized? Well, it would have been, there wasn't, so the apostasy would have been the original apostles dying, and nobody having the authority to carry on. And so the Catholic Church would have been the biggest usurper of Christ's church and name, right? And then an argument that Joseph Smith made was, well, the Protestants all say that the Catholic Church is a rotten tree, but they're all branches of that rotten tree. So what does that say about that?
Yes, well, my question, so it's been interesting to hear just how service-oriented Mormons generally are, it sounds like. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, does it have, Protestants who say, by faith and not by works that we're saved, right? And you have, for us, right, it's like, well, you have to cooperate with God's grace, and by that, right? So it's kind of faith and works, right? And then, I guess I'm kind of wondering where Mormons would fall in that sort of debate to that.
Yeah, there's a scripture in the Book of Mormon that says, by faith you are saved after all you can do, which is also...
Is it by faith or by grace? By grace.
Grace?
By grace.
I haven't read my Book of Mormon in a little while. When I was growing up, when I was going to seminary, the class he talked about, I was not sleeping on my desk. I was like, I gotta be good. And this question came up, and the object lesson that I was given was, it's like a pair of scissors. Like, you need faith and you need works, and they work together. And for me, at however old I was, 13, that satisfied it. So that's a very basic answer that some Mormons would be carrying around with them.
And Mormons don't see themselves as Protestants, so we're not fighting the Catholic Church. So we don't have a bone in that fight as the Protestants do against the Catholics. So it's not as contentious as an issue for us, right? And for Mormons, this is another touch point. Mormons are kind of I wouldn't say liturgical, but we have sacraments, right? We have every week we do the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. In our temple, we have sacraments that you can do every day, right? Just like how Catholics go to Mass Mass every day. Mormons every day can go to the temple, and we do baptisms for the dead. We do marriages for the dead, which we call sealings. We do a ceremony called the endowment, which is the ceremony to the clothing, but it's also kind of like a lesson, like a class you go through for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and it's and you do it on behalf of the dead. And so even in their worship, you're not there for yourself, right? You're there for your dead. You're there for your ancestors. And so the doctrine of purgatory, praying for the dead, that's another. So Catholics can reach out with they focus on the sacraments and with their concern for the dead. Those are huge things for Mormons.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, I'm over here. Do you think that the Mormon Church will continue like a strong stance of conservative morals, or do you think they're going to start to capitulate with the culture? I remember you guys talking about birth control. It used to be kind of a strong thing, and the prophet just sort of stopped talking about it. Do you think they'll keep a strong stance about marriage and family and children and gay marriage and all that, or can they go the way of the culture? This is just your opinion.
I don't know if they can stand without. Follow the prophet is not good enough. It's not a good enough reason, right? So a lot of Mormons left over gay marriage. Because the Mormon Church does not have a good argument for, like, what is the nature of sex? What is the purpose of sex, right? And if you turn away from that purpose, you're violating nature, right? That's not a Mormon argument. Mormons are, the prophet says it's bad, right? And so that's not good enough. That's not, people are going to, so if the Mormon Church remains, a lot of its members won't, because that's not enough for a lot of members to say, oh, the prophet says so. For the institutions, for the religious school, BYU, when Kathy and I went there 15 years ago, however long ago it was, the humanities department was full of communists. She's like, why do we keep reading about Marx? I thought this was an English program, right? So that's infiltrated, right? And then I have one of my friends from college, from BYU, where I'm in college, Brigham Young University. He works for the church in the church office building in Salt Lake, half a block away from the temple, in the same temple complex. Beautiful place, go visit him sometime. He's just a full-blown, woke, anti-white supremacy, everybody's racist person. He works in church headquarters. And so they're infiltrated, right? You have anything to say about that?
A few issues have come up, social issues, etc., over the last 20, 30 years or so. I guess the leaders in the Mormon church have said, okay, this is what the prophet now says about this. Can you talk about some of those issues, or how that works? I guess at the top.
Can you say the question again?
Okay, whatever.
So the question, as I understand it, is like in the last 20, 30 years, as different prophets have said different things, how does it change? Is that?
Yeah, how does it work at the top?
Does the prophet come out?
Who decides for the prophet?
Okay.
The
Oh,
second-
wonderful. Okay. So yeah, the hierarchy is that there is a prophet at the top, and he has 2 counselors that are the first presidency, and then there are 12 apostles. So they're like aiming for that same structure. And as far as who becomes the next prophet, that's just seniority within the 12 apostles. So once somebody is the president of the Mormon Church, the prophet, they're just doing that for the rest of their life. And then when they pass away, the next senior apostle is made the prophet, and they choose their counselors. And so as far as how that works at the top, I've never been to any of their meetings, so I'm not 100% sure. But there are statements that the first presidency will issue about different events or different social issues. And so it's an official statement issued through the Mormon Church newsroom. And then they'll usually have one of the apostles do like some sort of press conference, answer questions. Mormons are very orderly in like the way that they roll things out. So like there was a change, every 6 months there's a big conference, a worldwide conference that they broadcast. I loved it growing up because it was pajama church. You just got to stay home and watch like hours and hours of church on TV, and you make cinnamon rolls. It was great. But they will like often roll out big news in those like at General Conference, so you watch it so that you know where the next temple is going to be built, what the new big announcements are, what is going on. So it is very orderly in that, like, any big changes or announcements are usually run through that 6-month cycle, and you kind of know that it's coming. There haven't been any necessarily like big revelations necessarily in the last little. I don't know how I'm in that sentence, so I'm gonna give it to him.
I want to say something about. She's mentioned seniority. So the man who's been an apostle longest becomes the next president, and so Mormon church leadership tends to be very old, and for that reason conservative. And then as far as the specific social issues I can think of, in the last 30 years, they have not changed their stance on gay marriage or the family. Women, there was a big protest of women who wanted the priesthood. We have it's a lay priesthood, but it's men only. And women came to church activities and protested and wanted to get the priesthood, and the church stood fast on that. And they stood fast on gay marriage and what marriage is. So for the last 30 years, they've stood strong on those things. Now, the one thing we've seen them slipping on is contraception. And that wasn't spoken, it wasn't said, they just kind of stopped talking about it. Sorry for
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah, first of all, Father, can we get something going every 6 months where we eat cinnamon rolls all day?
You started that, but I'll let her live stream it for
I'll bring the cinnamon rolls.
All right, second of all, so Lorenzo Snow has this, one of your presidents, I mean, not your presidents, but said he has a famous couplet, and I'd like you guys to talk about it a little bit. As man is, God once was. As God is now, man may become. So could you explain that?
Well, in fact, I think this is something you can preach. This is a commonality with Catholics and Mormons, that we become God.
Yeah.
So the beatific vision is the Catholic phrase for what we experience in heaven, right? What is that? Unity with God. The Orthodox, I listen to a lot of Jonathan Pajot's podcasts. He's an Orthodox icon carver. So before I became Catholic, I seriously considered Orthodoxy. And I still listen to Jonathan Pajot, he's great. But it's theosis. So the Orthodox don't call it beatific vision, they call it theosis. What does that mean? The life of God. What is the liturgy? It's living the life of God. What is the Eucharist? It's becoming one with God, right? And so it's not as crazy. I mean, they understand it differently, obviously. But that is in fact, instead of being something silly that Mormons believe, it's in fact a commonality, right? That's the goal, is the life of God, and unity with God. For Mormons, they just don't understand who God is. They don't have a correct theology. And so their vision of what that looks like is I'll have lots of kids forever with my wife and you need a planet, you're gonna have kids forever. You need a lot of space. Which is why the universe is so big, right? Look at NASA.
I'm curious how your family responded to it.
Can I go first? Actually, mine's really short and sweet. My family was in town the week of my baptism and left 2 days before because they just don't care, right? I'm the weird religious one. They're still atheists. So they're like, all right, whatever you're doing.
We can invite them.
Yeah.
My family lives in Utah. So the geographical divide is we're not necessarily involved in each other's day to day. And so my siblings were all really supportive. The one sibling who was curious and asked questions is my one brother who has left the Mormon church. We had a long conversation. He was kind of just interested in hearing me out. I think he was really, I think he kind of paved the way for it to be a little bit easier because everyone had already seen he left and the relationships were not broken. They weren't lost. So I kind of owe him a debt of gratitude, and he was curious and just, I think, kind of grateful that he was no longer the only black sheep in the family. My mom lives with us, and I think it's been hard for her because we moved her from Utah, and I think she had an idea that we would be going to church together, and so that was a disappointment for her, but she's been super gracious about all of it.
And I don't know if we covered it well enough, but I mean, Kathy was devastated at the thought of leaving the Mormon church, right? When it became a reality that I was going to become a Catholic, and when it became more of a reality that she might become a Catholic too, she said, "I'm leaving the religion of my childhood." And then she started weeping. It's hard.
At the park, it was really awkward.
Yeah. You want to say more about that? Like, what was it like for you?
Yeah, there was this moment where I realized, like, okay, what I have invested all this time in, and all of this energy and faith, and I went to Brazil for a year and a half and dressed super frumpy, and there was so much that I had put into this with really earnest belief, and so much goodness had come into my life that it was like to realize, like, oh, this actually doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and I can't unsee that. That's not an easy. It's just not an easy experience to go through, So yeah, I guess of anyone in my family, I had it the hardest. I was the most resistant to it.
How did your kids take it, especially your oldest?
You want to tell the, okay. So for my own reasons, I think if somebody becomes Orthodox, I'm just happy for them. I think that's great. I think that's how Catholics generally feel about the Orthodox. We're like, oh, that's great, you're Orthodox, that's great. And then they see us as heretics. But we were pretty convinced about Catholicism. But I was like, what about Orthodoxy? What if that's the thing? And we've been going to atonement in the class and bringing our kids for a few months. And then our oldest daughter, we went to a Greek Orthodox worship service. And our oldest daughter got physically ill. I think she was just...
So our oldest is 12. We have a 12, 5, and 2-year-old. And our 12-year-old has kind of... God blessed us with a very adaptable child. Like, she has just gone with us on this journey. Like he said, it's 9 years. It's like most of her life of us, like, being like, what are you doing? And she's just, like, gone with it. Like, we had gone and visited some other churches when I first was like, what do I tell my daughters about what God thinks of them? Like, so she'd gone with us to lots of places, and it felt like we had finally landed on Catholicism. And so when he was like, let's just be sure, extra sure, she was like, I'm gonna throw up. She just could not stomach it. And she was kind of a holdout. She was a little bit resistant to Catholicism, and I wasn't trying to convince her because I was not convinced myself. And as soon as I had the moment, it was a specific day when things shifted for me, and I was committed, and I was like, yes, I'm doing this. She did as well, because she said, she told me, if mom's gonna do this, like, I know that you both are set, we're gonna do this, and I was like, well, are you, like, do you believe it? Are you convinced? She's like, oh yeah, I was just waiting for you.
And for our oldest daughter too, before we had decided to become Catholic, that was the hardest time for her, because she just didn't know what to say to her Mormon friends or her Catholic friends, like, so what are you doing here? Or what are you, so she was waiting for us. She's amazing. Our first daughter was like this angel, angelic baby. So we thought we were amazing parents. And we were just like, we were looking down our noses at all the other parents. And then we had another kid.
She's also
wonderful. Sorry.
So, as an outsider looking at the LDS church, I always had a lot of respect for it. I saw a really strong community. I saw this seemed to be a very robust institution that had this really structured mission for missionaries to go out and learn languages very efficiently. I saw also this really strong
mean, the biggest thing I think is community, right? We don't go to our local parish, we go to the parish that we were converted in. And this feels like home for us. And I feel like maybe if we get really strong in our faith, we'll start going to the less beautiful local parish, right? But I would not have converted to Catholicism, or it would have been much harder to convert to Catholicism if the Mass was not beautiful, right? Beautiful Mass made it easier for my wife, right? When I was convinced and I was taking her Mass, going every week and being astounded by beauty was very helpful. The lack of beauty in certain Masses is a big problem, but the lack of community that can happen in Catholic Church, right? And I feel like atonement is pretty great because the Mass ends and we go outside and kind of talk for a while and chat. It's nice. But the idea of like a local parish, I just think that's such a beautiful idea and it's kind of gone. Mormonism also has Utah where they're politically dominant. I think that's great. I think Catholics need to politically dominate the areas they live in.
I'd like to point out that our president is currently Catholic.
The other problem with the Catholic Church is it doesn't excommunicate people fast enough.
To your point, those things that you talked about, a lot of that kind of stems from this geographical assignment that Mormons have, that if you move, you don't keep going to the parish or the ward where you knew everybody. You go to the places that, like, you live inside these geographical boundaries, so you go at 9:30, or you go at 11:30, or and once you get there, it's kind of expected that you're just going to accept an assignment. You're going to be assigned to go work with the nursery kids, or you're going to accept an assignment to help, everybody is kind of assigned a friend. So there's something about Mormons that they're very good at organizing things happening in the world. That there may not be a lot of time to sit and contemplate because like there's just a lot of doing. I mean, one of Utah's mottos is industry. Like that's, and I think part of that kind of came out of the history that like Mormons got kicked out from place to place to place, and they're like, fine, we're just gonna go out in the middle of nowhere where like nobody wants to come and bug us, and there's not anything here, so we're gonna have to work really hard, and we're gonna have to do it together, or we're gonna die. And there's something in that like, I mean, there's something in me, really, that's like in my blood that I'm like, I've got to just keep going and going and going. And Christopher's like, stop. So I think there's something in the organization itself that that kind of fosters those sorts of connections. And it's harder to just like reach out yourself and see a need. But also something really lovely about it, because Mormons do get burnt out on community at times, of all of the things that they're assigned to do, that sometimes in rebellion they're like, I'm not going to make that casserole, I'm not signing up for that on that clipboard that goes around Sunday school, because it's a lot. So there's a balance of doing what it is that you feel called to do, and reaching out to neighbors around you.